Today we have with us Ms. Hilora Ratnayake. Hilora Ratnayake is an information security, data management, and privacy professional with a decade of experience in the domain. She has expertise across banking, finance, IT, IoT, and government entities locally and globally. Hilora is currently working at a health NG in Dubai, and Hilora holds a bachelor's degree in computer systems and networking from the University of Greenwich, UK. We are privileged to have her here to share her insights on data deluge, taming the tide with the privacy and AI. Hilora, over to you.
Thank you very much, Gagani. Give me a moment to share my screen. Please let me know when you can see my screen. Is my screen visible?
Yes, Hilora.
Perfect. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Gagani and Vimurtini, for this opportunity. So today we're going to dive into data, the data deluge. What do you think when you hear the word data deluge? Let's talk about that shortly. So before we get started, data in the age of digital and AI is something that has evolved through and through the years. We have come from a simple diskette, a floppy disk and a USB drive, and moved on to the cloud. And with the cloud, we are using and utilizing data on a day-to-day perspective. Data is life cycle, is basically the creation, the storage, the use, sharing, archival, and destruction of data. And with this, we have an overwhelming problem of the overwhelming amount of data that we create. There is an overwhelming amount and variety of data that is generated, collected, stored in our digital world. And this phenomenon has actually created an increasing reliance in data, as well as a phenomenon where there is that sheer volume and velocity of data that we struggle to manage, that we're trying to figure out how to really get into one centralized repository. And also where we have a data quality managed. So how do we manage data? How do we ensure that our personal data is secure? How do we ensure that we have data that is actually consistent to our requirements? So you know that there is an overwhelming rapid increase of the utilization of data. And with that, we have an information overflow where we have, for example, 28,000 Netflix subscribers, 695,000 Instagram stories shared per day. In 60 seconds, you have 9,132 posts on LinkedIn. You have 69 million WhatsApp messages. So with all of these sheer increase in the reliance of data, we actually need to understand what is the role of security and privacy in these aspects. So data comes in various forms of structured, unstructured, and semi-structured data. So this can vary from personal information that we share to just do day-to-day transactions, banking transactions, business purposes, scientific research, or just walking outside, going to a restaurant and tapping your debit card just to make a purchase, you're sharing data. So with all of these requirements and the sheer volume of data that we share per day, we need to understand that there are definitely opportunities to improve decision-making. There are challenges of information overload, data storage and management, and of course, the concern of privacy and security. So with this rise, we have also understood that there are multiple issues of data privacy, misinformation and bias, security vulnerabilities, as well as ethical concerns. Now, in the utilization of AI that comes from our day-to-day usage of data, we have also had a quite large reliance of technology, where we have initiated collecting and storing data just so that we can do our day-to-day needs. So in these instances, there are rising breaches or misuse of artificial intelligence that has certain concerns that have been risen. So in these cases, what we have to understand is that in this common data-driven world, we have to navigate this sea very effectively to ensure that the more data that we generate, we are more liable or vulnerable to data breaches. And in these cases, how do we really protect ourselves from this? And another concerning trend in the use of AI is that there is a sophistication of attacks, phishing attacks. For example, in 2023, there's a study that actually uncovered that AI-generated phishing mails were remarkably convincing because AI has the ability to mimic human writing style and personalize the content based on publicly available information. So this is where we have to be very cautious of what data we actually share when in our day-to-day tasks. So with this, let's talk about the pillars of information security. How does security and privacy come into this picture? So the three main pillars of information security is the CIA triad, or the confidentiality, integrity, and availability triad. In terms of confidentiality, this means that we need to ensure that data is accessible only to authorized parties. We only give that access to based on the principle of need to know, which is if you need to know, you will have access to this data. If not, you will not. And the integrity of maintaining and assuring that the data that we have is consistent and accurate. And further, the availability, ensuring that data has the accessibility whenever and wherever that it is actually required, and ensuring that there is a timely, reliable access and utilization of this data. Now let's talk about some common misconceptions of security. So some of the key challenges and some of the key matters that actually lead to breaches of information security or data security is actually just these few pointers that I would like to highlight. We think that we have nothing to hide, so we don't need to worry about security. But the reality is everyone has information that should be protected. Our financial data, our personal data, even our communications are very personal to us. The second misconception is that strong passwords are enough to keep my data safe. While it is important that we have strong passwords, but this is just one layer of security. So always ensuring that we have multi-factor security practices enabled is something that would really ease protecting our data. The third misconception is that cybersecurity is not really our concern. It's something that people in the domains of security, IT, and information security must do. No, this is not the case. Everyone in the world that utilizes data or information has that responsibility to maintain security, because humans can be the strongest link in protecting their own data. And the fourth misconception is that small businesses or just personal data of an individual is not targeted because they're not something that people would deem necessary or malicious actors would deem to be important. This is not the case. Every piece of information is something that is gravely valuable to any malicious actors. So now let's talk about data privacy, given that data privacy is the pillar, or a few years back, maybe back 10 years ago, information security was what it was on the rise, and data privacy broke into a branch of this. So within the introduction of GDPR and privacy regulations, we have now seen a huge increase in the data privacy landscape across domains in the global front. So if you can see the screen, this map that I'm sharing with you is actually a display of all the countries that actually have data privacy laws and regulations enforced. And for wherever there's the red selections, this means that they have very heavy regulations. There are very heavy regulations that are actually applicable in terms of, sorry, I just noticed that my video isn't on. Is it okay now? Sorry about that. So there are very hefty laws and regulations that are actually applicable in terms of all of these countries. And in this case, sorry, let me just, okay. Now, I currently work in the United Arab Emirates, and just alone in the UAE, we have multiple regulations that actually enforce the privacy of individuals. So we have federal laws, we have extraterritorial laws, we have financial related privacy laws, as well as regulations that are also arising based on the data that you share out of domain or cross domain. So in these cases, what we really need to understand is that there are key principles of data privacy that we have to adhere to. So what is the data privacy ecosystem? What are the principles that we rely on for privacy? What are the main considerations of privacy? So we have the ecosystem of data privacy, which is reliant on a data subject, which is us as an individual and a data controller. Any organization, we actually consent to giving our data. This organization can be having joint or alone controlling ownership of our data to process or to control the requirements that we provide them to transact with our data. And the data processes are who the data controllers actually engage with. And in these instances, they are the ones who will be processing our data to ensure that the requirements that we are trying to fulfill are actually in place. So now let's talk about the principles. So GDPR, with the introduction of the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, there have been 7 principles of privacy that have been introduced. And these principles include lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. So what is lawfulness, fairness, and transparency? In this day and age, if you walk into or if you browse through any website, you would see a notification that actually shows you something called a cookie notice or a privacy notice. So this is something that every individual has to have an understanding of and have to go through, because this is when an organization actually commits and also discloses to you what type of data do they actually process? What are the use cases of your data in their organization or in these services that we utilize through their web applications, through their services? And then we have purpose limitation. So in this case, the organization that you're sharing your personal data with should ensure that this personal data is only processed for the purpose that you have shared this for. For example, I'm sharing my personal data with a bank just so that I can do banking transactions. But this does not allow them the right, unless I consent to share this with a third party to give me offers to go to a movie theater. But these recommendations or emails, they cannot be shared with me unless I have consented to this. Now we have storage limitation. So storage limitation is basically, if you look back at the data life cycle, how long would that data be stored for? Have we given them the right to store this data? Data cannot be kept for any longer than necessary, unless there is a federal or legal requirement where, for example, in most use cases, financial data has to be kept by an organization for archiving purposes for 10 years. But post this, they have to ensure that this data is destructed or anonymized. And what you mean by anonymized is that the transaction of my history does not tie back to me as a person when they store that data archived. And also to ensure the accuracy of the data and the minimization principle, where data will be adequate and relevant and limited to what purpose that they actually collected this data for. And then the accuracy, where the data is accurate, up to date, and does not have any data that is not basically, if my address was changed, then they need to have the updated information. And now we have integrity and confidentiality. So based on the principles of the CIA triad, this ensures that all the data that we store with any organization or any transaction that we do should maintain utmost confidentiality and accountability. Who are the owners of this data? For example, if we're sharing this data with an organization, they have to implement the technical controls, they have to have data owners, and they need to ensure that this data is processed only for the business purpose that we provided them consent to. Now, why is privacy important for an organization or an individual? For an organization, it would be to protect their brand, but for an individual, it would be to protect your personal data and your identity. It would also be to manage your risks, because as a person, if I lose my personal data, if I lose my financial data, then this would actually cause a significant financial impact to my, if disclosed or if breached. And for an organization, it is important to build trust. And also, for an organization, it is important to comply with regulations. Now, what are the obligations of privacy? Privacy obligations include, so this top-down approach triad, that I have displayed here actually shows what are the obligations any organization should have towards us when we share our data to them. They need to maintain the main principles of data minimization, quality, security, and they need to ensure that the justification purposes of actually processing this data. They need to maintain records that actually ensure that these are the history or logs of why they process their data, the reason for this, and who should this be actually shared with, and these third parties that are part of this engagement. And the data protection obligations in this case is also that controllers need to implement necessary safeguards aligning to legal and regulatory requirements, and data governance. So there needs to be an appointed data protection officer in any organization based on the volume of data that they process. And in that case, they actually need to ensure that this individual is who you can actually directly communicate with for enforcing your data rights, data subject rights. So you have the right to withdraw consent. You have the right to request for what data is being processed. You have the right to update your data. So these rights come with the legal enforcements of the privacy laws based on your domains or the areas that you're at. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room. How can we maintain privacy with AI? So all of these principles that we actually discussed about is what leads to the baseline foundation of ensuring to maintain privacy. So when it comes to AI systems, how should we ensure this? So AI systems should be trained in a manner that they would only process the minimum amount of data. Personal data is either avoided or based on the use case. And federated learning. So in this technique, we have to ensure that AI models have to be trained on a decentralized manner, where there is a reduced need of centralization, which ensures that personal data or any confidential data is not actually acquired through and through. And differential privacy, adding controlled noise to data sets can protect an individual while also maintaining data security. So this would actually mean that you would segregate the level of data that you disclose in terms of doing analytics purposes. For example, if an organization wants to understand the trend of the utilization of their services. For example, if it's a bank and they would want to maintain or update a new product, and in this case, they are trying to understand the amount of customer base they have within the bank, and they're trying to enforce a new application, for example, something for the youth where it engages them to use their smartwatches and statistics of the exercises that they do within a day. And in that data is sent back to different third parties to actually provide you with new plans, services such as sports athletic requirements, athletic services, or fitness training purposes. So in this case, they have to ensure that this is something that I consent to, and that you are authorizing this bank to actually take your data and do these analytics. And now you have privacy-preserving machine learning techniques, where encryption and data anonymization techniques has to be enforced if the data is being processed, and robust consent mechanisms. So as I mentioned, there should be a record of, for example, you have emails that you get where you, so either, even in the case, so in these cases, it is very important for any organization or any web platform or application or website to actually have that checkbox in their site, which actually directly takes that consent from you to see whether you're okay to receive those emails or notifications. And in the case of processing their data, for your data for some service that they provide, they need to maintain the logs of signed consent. For example, banks have a very robust and guided manner where they have to actually ensure that this data that they're processing for you actually follows through the consent principles. So as AI becomes more integrated into our day-to-day lives, it is easy to forget that these systems are not just tools, but also data processes. So every piece of information that we feed into an AI system could potentially be stored, utilized, analyzed, and trained on future models. So this is why we need to be extremely careful and cautious about what data we input into these AI models. For example, there's a rising use of AI systems like ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude.ai. So in these cases, we have to ensure that everything and anything that you actually share can go into the public, and this can have a negative impact if this data is actually utilized in a malicious intent. So in these cases, we need to treat these systems as we would treat a public forum. Would we want our personal information to be in a public forum? No. So personally identifiable information should never be inputted into an AI system such as ChatGPT or any language processor, or unless it is absolutely crucial. For example, certain organizations utilize this manner, but in terms of personal usage, do we really need to do this? No, because personal data such as names, addresses, phone numbers, identity card numbers, or financial information can actually be utilized against you. And confidential data should be sanitized, and your inputs needs to be anonymized. For example, if an organization is utilizing your data, they have to ensure that your data put into analytical purposes must be de-anonymized, which means that they would not be able to identify or disclose who you are unless this is actually for a legitimate requirement. And be wary of the context. So even if individual pieces of information that you share online may seem harmless, be careful of how they might be interconnected. For example, if you include one personal data element such as your name on Facebook, and you include something as your financial data in a WhatsApp message, there may be certain use cases where this can actually be disclosed. So even in the case of using any tools online, we need to ensure that sensitive data is something that you would always stop taking that risk of disclosing online. And also ensure that you do not include this in any public forums. So the rule of thumb in terms of really understanding how to maintain privacy in this age of AI and data is to ensure that you follow the rule of thumb of not inputting any personal data such as financial transaction or any data that includes your name and financial details into any system online. Now, by following these perspectives, we can understand the risks to our data, as well as how to control and mitigate these risks. So given this age of data and AI, it does not only present imminent opportunities, there are also significant challenges. So what we need to do is understand what data is, recognize these risks, identifying breaches, and implementing strong practices to ensure that personal data is kept safe, and data privacy and security is the main perspective of what we actually ensure to give control to. So based on these requirements and regulations on the general, So based on these principles that we discussed, we need to ensure that whatever data that we include or publish online is something that is always up to us. So safeguarding our data based on the principles that we discussed a short while ago is our responsibility. So thank you. If there are any questions, please add them in the forum and I will get to you.
Thank you for that informative speech, Hilora. And I would like to request the audience to ask if they have any questions. You can unmute and ask yourself.
Okay, Hilora, I have one question. So this happened sometime back when I was trying to enroll my baby to daycare. So I filled a form to book a tour time, they call it, where we can just go and see the place and decide whether we are going to enroll the baby or not. And then I submitted it, and a day later, I got a call from a lady who's claiming that she's from the place and asking me for my birthday and my child's birthday and my address. I found that quite odd because in the form, I remember entering my email and phone number, which are pretty much the only things that they need to contact me and say that your tour can be booked on this day, because they don't need like how old I am or how old my baby is to get to know. So when we come across things like that feels fishy a little, so I went back to the site that I submitted the form and checked, but it seems legit. There is actually a daycare like that here, and it has several branches. So I was thinking, like, what if like that might be happening to so many parents, right? It's like my data, which was intended to go to only the daycare for that purpose, is like I started questioning back when I got the call, and she straight away cut the call. It's like she understood that I didn't like blindly give all the information. So I just want to know if like we submit forms, right? Even for this, like we get the registrations and everything. But how do we figure out if it's like a correct or like, a legit place that we are filling the information or not? Is there like a way that we can figure it out? Hilora, I think you're on mute.
I'm extremely sorry about that. So there are two perspectives in this regard. In most cases, what happens, for example, is that the data that you actually give, so for example, you had a legitimate use, you wanted to go to a daycare and provide this information so that your child can be enrolled there. But in certain instances, there are actually reasons where there are certain individuals who might take your data from this organization and share it with external parties. So if you're actually submitting this information online, then some of the key elements that you can consider is to see just do your background research on this organization. Does it exist? Which you have done, which is great. But sometimes we often forget. And when we actually see something that actually catches our attention, we just enroll. So another thing that we have to consider is that when we're providing our data, we need to ensure that we limit it to what we're sharing this for. And also, when you're surfing the internet, if you're going to a website, some of those key elements, such as seeing whether the website is HTTPS, seeing whether you're actually providing this information to a legitimate person. For example, here in the UAE, there are a lot of scams. Once I came here initially, there was an instance where my data was actually shared only to my employer, and they shared my data to a bank in order to actually create an account for me. But the next day, I received a call where this individual, who was actually very aggressive at one point as well, requested for my Emirates ID information just so that they can update the banking information. But see, here we have certain guidelines and regulations where we need to answer organizations only if that call comes from a landline number and it shows the tag that this is from this organization. But in certain countries, we actually don't have this. So we have to be mindful who we talk to, what data do we share online. And also when it comes to children's information, this is actually by the General Data Protection Regulation, which is applicable to the EU, and also in Australia, you have the Privacy Act, and in other countries as well. It is illegal to utilize data of children. So you do not have any right to process this information of any child unless there is parental consent, or if it is a legitimate purpose, for example, for healthcare. So it's always a matter of being mindful about what data you actually share. And I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you, Hilora.
Thank you. I think we have another question, Madhubhashini.
Yes, thank you. You mentioned the security risks in regarding sharing financial information. I think today, we use a lot, we enter a lot of information into different platforms like bank information, bank details and all, even like you said, we share through emails, WhatsApp and all.
Right.
So
Yes.
I would like, if you can explain briefly what type of measures that we should take in terms of safeguarding our information, because there are times that we really need to share those information with, in certain instances. How could we do that? Yeah, thank you very much.
Correct. So in certain cases, there are instances, I think, especially in Sri Lanka, I have come across this issue where banks or any organizations actually tend to request for your personal data over WhatsApp communication channels or just a brief text. But to be honest, as a global standard, this is not recommended. And what usually any organization does is request you to actually reply to legitimate emails from those entities. So you have to send to the designated customer service email address or so on. And if someone is actually inquiring for your personal data, for some instance that you think is rather fishy or maybe something that is not actually required, you can question this because it is your right. And I think right now we have a personal data protection regulation that is enforced in Sri Lanka as well. So in these cases, the first thing that we need to do is understand why this organization is requesting for your information. And if it's financial data, always ensure that you're only processing or you're only entering this information for actually required use case. So if you're doing a financial transaction, always ensure that the URL on that website is something that is an HTTPS or a secure link. And also this is from the bank that you're actually going to do this transaction from. Or for example, if you're going to do some grocery shopping, then ensure that it is actually from this store that it is being redirected to. And in certain cases, if they're requiring the information that you think is not necessary, then this is definitely something that you can inquire back. You can call them, you can email them. So in certain cases, because controls are not implemented as we would like, it is always a matter of being aware of what is around us. It is always a matter of being aware that you have rights as a data subject. You can withdraw consent. You can request what actual data they are processing of you. You can actually do transactions only based on that requirement. You can actually limit banks from sharing your data. So it's always good to be mindful of this. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Do we have any more questions?